And what I'd like to do in sort of the next 10 minutes is really set out some of the foundational concepts of my framework, what I call health ecosystem value design, or HEVD, the main sort of method deployed in the studio at NYIT this spring semester. Also, I want to briefly propose then how the framework informs, I think, the method and task of transdisciplinary urban design with health. So I think the first important concept in the framework is actually how it defines health and how it defines health. So although sort of wholly incorporated, it's not a framework that's just for health care, for the design, the innovation and organization of healthcare and healthcare systems. Rather, it's a framework for the transdisciplinary creation of health, with health defined really in its widest sense as a power for acting, a power for accessing, creating, and sustaining a desired, valued life or lived experience. So in this sort of wide and normative reframing of health, we move far beyond a more narrow bodily, baseline, functioning, and resource for living definition of health. Instead, we see health as a capacity for accessing and acquiring what are known as affects, sensations, feeling states of positive lived experience that are constituted by 10 relational elements of what I call social desire. As you can see in the model here, these elements include a full expected life duration, bodily vitality, bodily integrity, creativity, a sense of belonging and attachment, a human connection, a connection with nature, and the ability to play and experience and have fun in life. All of the elements adapted from Martha Nussbaum's 10 central capabilities in her book, Creating Capabilities, and this sort of view that's used a lot in sort of development work throughout the world. So with health defined widely as this sort of affective capacity for living well, the framework helps us to address 3 difficult and usually neglected questions in the empirical health and life sciences. These concern the question of how do lived experiences with health originate or form, especially for chronic diseases such as chronic pain and obesity, respiratory and cardiac disease, as well as more social dis-eases, such as the experience of abuse and violence, the experience of neglect, of exploitation, injustice, inequity, and inequality. Second, for any given focal context, such as these, it also asks questions about how do lived experiences with health disease become different? How do they emerge over a duration of experience, their becoming? And third, it explores how and why do certain experiences, particularly negative experiences, persist and become concentrated in types of individuals and social groups, in communities, in neighborhoods, and in sort of our concern in particular in urban design, in places and certain spaces. By addressing all these questions, we can then begin to discover the means to design differently and how to sort of proceed from here differently. And to address them then, the sort of third core foundation of the framework is that it deploys an interactional and an active model of human experience and human agency. It views the human as an interactional agential being whose lived experience is actualized from interactions with other humans and also with material entities that also have agency in these 4 registers or affective domains as shown in this dynamic moving model. So these 4 domains are at the bottom there, bodily, motor, the sort of organic register of interactions within the body with what we put into the body, food, drink, and drugs usually, and its motor or movement interactions. This domain, this register, the usual focus of the physical healthcare disciplines. We also have the social cultural domain, the register of interactions with other persons, with groups within and between, with and in organizations. And on the right there, we have a domain of material spatial interactions, interactions with objects, with technologies, with buildings, and other material forms, as well as interactions in and through our built and natural environments pertinent to our particular context today. And finally, at the top, we have this sort of perceptual cognitive register of sense making, perception and meaning making of interactions in the other three registers. So through diverse interactions with both human and non-human entities in these four registers, people's lived experiences, our lived experiences, become actualized and variously stuck or stabilized via transitions in affects, sensations, impressions, feelings, states, as I mentioned, and their various qualities, content, and expression, and also the different affective capacities we have to harness desired or repel undesired affects. So moving quickly through the core concepts, a fourth core concept in the framework is that a movement beyond static empirical methods for seeing, identifying, categorizing, and representing experience. Methods usually represented in maps via social, demographic, economic categories, via kind of common identities of different groups, via quantitative data abstractions, and via emotion-based expressions of experience. Avoiding then an exclusive kind of analytical empirical tendency, the framework identifies a virtual real domain of what of pre-experienced affects, of pre-individual capacities and tendencies that kind of serve as the originating generative mechanisms of lived experience with health and disease, and also of their differentiation. So to support this sort of the transdisciplinary design task, the Umio framework then distinguishes 9 interactional flows in this sort of virtual yet real field. Each flow bearing certain types of natural, man-made, and human social entities bearing potential affects and potential affective capacities. And these include the material artifactual entities such as buildings and other designed elements in the built environment. So translating this conceptualization of a virtual field and incorporating another foundation in the framework of 6 tendential forces that influence them, we can now see how any place, whether urban or rural, here pinpointing the Arkansas Delta on Earth, how any place already contains certain predominant pre-experienced intensities, qualities, and relations of affects, capacities, and their tendencies. A virtual real view of experience formation that helps us to see the more hidden and often the negative pre-experience affects and those stuck tendencies that are present in poor neighborhoods, in poor communities, and which via ongoing interactions produce experiences of disease, often over generations. It helps us to see especially the forces of the negative affects and tendencies of hopelessness, of despair, of exclusion, that diminish the potential capacity for realizing that social desire in health, whether for a place and for the people who live there. So with this view, for any focal context of lived experience, we can frame a virtual field, or what I call a focal experience ecosystem, for any given place, such as a small town in the Arkansas Delta, as the students did in the course. And doing so helps us to see who are the affectees of this experience, the people, groups, communities affected, and also what I call the affectors, the non-human environmental and material elements, as well as the human ideas, tendencies, and actors having positive or negative influence or neutral influence on a focal context of experience. And with this model now, critically, our lens on lived experience transcends disciplinary separations of learning, design, and action, which are themselves products of tendencies of observation of method and targets of creation. And thus, through this way of seeing, we see the open city design and health task as stated here, the transdisciplinary design of ideas, interactions, flows, spaces, and material forms, all bearing potential capacities for individuals, communities, and places to access and sustain health as social desire, forming positive lived experience. So to summarize, these are the 4 core concepts of health ecosystem value design that we applied in our Design Plus Health course this spring semester. A very wide, the widest, arguably, definition of health beyond care as potential capacities of social desire. Second, a focus on questions of the origin, differentiation, and persistence of lived experiences with health, and particularly disease and illness. Third, this perspective of the human as entangled in interactional flows of multi-agency. And fourth, a framing of the learning and design purpose within this sort of virtual real field or experience ecosystem for a focal context of experience, and usually defined by a particular geography or place. So following the health ecosystem value design method and using the pre-built templates, which you can download from the Umio website, our students' journey was as follows. First, select and research a small town or city in the Arkansas Delta. Define a focal context of lived experience, usually of negative lived experience, and then frame the project and purpose. Second, map the affects characterizing positive and negative poles of capacities for that selected focal context. Then third, map the virtual field, the experience ecosystem of human and non-human effectors influencing the ongoing production of the focal lived experience in that place. Fourth, and a really critical step, is to then step back and reflect on your own and others' tendencies or disciplinary tendencies of perspective, method, design, and creation and action. And then, following from that reflection, design the desired transitions in lived experience for targeted affectees. And only at that point, undertake the actual design work, the architectural, urban, or spatial project design activity, having gone through these earlier steps in the flow of the process. So very briefly, these are the 4 focal experience contexts that the 4 project groups of the students selected, and not by luck rather than by design, each has a particular focus in one of those 4 registers of affective domains of experience. I'll show you the video of the group that undertook, that studied social stigma of persons accessing food bank. The other 3 groups, at the bottom there, they studied motor and movement disability, including hidden disabilities inhibiting access to foods. So this was in relation to food insecurity, but defined in a very wide sense in terms of sort of negative interactions with foods. The top one was a very interesting one around the perception of time, the experience of time in place, and the ennui or boredom from the repetitiveness in that experience duration of time. One of the students groups focused on that. And the last one was concerning a sense of exclusion, of spatial exclusion in particular, or non-belonging of young women, young mothers in a particular town in the Arkansas Delta. So let's see the design outputs of the group, as I mentioned, exploring social stigma in a video presented by students Naomi Kodo, Becky Lung, and Katie Trainer. So I can flip Christian to play this.